Okay, hello everyone. We are just getting started with our broadcast today. I'm really looking forward to this event conversation between two wonderful authors hosted by Wild Rumpus. We'll get started in just a minute or so, but I wanted to go over a few logistics before we dive into our conversation. So my name is Kara. I'm from Wild Rumpus, a children's and YA focused bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota. But we're really excited that we get to have some fantastic authors from a distance, with Alex joining us all the way from London today. So for the logistics, we really want to encourage you to type in the chat and share things with us. We want this to be as interactive as possible. Share where you're tuning in from, especially because we have kind of such a breadth of locations for this event today. So share that with us in the chat. And please ask questions as they pop up in your mind. We will have a chance to do a Q&A session with both of our authors kind of at the end of their conversation today. So keep typing your questions. You can do it either in the chat or in the Q&A box. It's up to you. The Q&A box is a great way to make sure that really precise questions will be answered later on. Also, take a look in the chat. We've posted a link to our website where we have all Alex's and Chris's books available. And for everyone attending today, we're really happy that you're able to join in live, and you get the extra perk of having a 15% off code for your next order with Wild Rumpus, and it's good for a month, so expires on November 24th. Make sure to get that in the chat before you leave today as well. So I think we'll get started, and I am so honored to have these two authors here today. Chris Farley, an author of 4 wonderful novels, will be here interviewing Alex Wheatle, who's joining us from all the way from London, and they'll be speaking primarily about Alex's brand new YA novel called Cane Warriors. But I'm sure we'll cover lots of different topics in our conversation today. So I'll hand it over to the two of you to introduce yourselves more in depth.
Well, I'll go first. Chris Farley. It's an honor to talk to Alex Wheatle about his wonderful new book, Cane Warriors. And I'm the author of a number of books myself, including books for young adults like Around Harvard Square, which recently came out. And before that, Game World, which drew on Caribbean history for a fantasy novel. And before that, I wrote a biography of Bob Marley called Before the Legend, The Rise of Bob Marley. So I was really impressed by reading Cane Warriors because I just know how difficult it is to take history, which can be dry, it can be difficult, it can be tangled, and turn it into a narrative that really has fire and blood and sweat, and is something that young people can understand and grasp and be inspired by. And you get all of that in Cane Warriors. You can see I'm still fired up about this book because I not only read it, but then I also listened to I work for Audible, I listened to the audio version, and the audio version brings it alive even more, and it's already alive on the printed page. It's great to hear it read, so it's great to talk to you. I also want to get into talking about the new series that you're featured in, because there's a series coming out called Small Axe that was executive produced by Steve McQueen, the great director of 12 Years a Slave, and each episode sort of talks about Caribbean history in London. And there's a whole episode called Alex Wheatle. You get a whole episode itself, which is incredible. So I'm looking forward to seeing that when that lands on Amazon Prime stateside. So hand it over to you to introduce yourself, but couldn't be more honored to talk to you.
Yes, and I feel honored to speak to you too. And I'm a massive fan of Bob Marley. In fact, his music and reggae music saved me in a way, because I was spent most of my childhood in a brutal children's home out of London. My parents met in the UK. They both came from Jamaica. My mother came from a small town called Richmond in St. Mary. My father came from Old Harbour. And then they embarked on a relationship, and I was born in 1963. but for various reasons, they could not look after me. My mother had to return to Jamaica to look after her family. She had 5 children already there. And my father tried to look after me the best way he could, but he couldn't quite cope. He had a breakdown. And so that led me to going into an institution that was, as I mentioned already, quite brutal. And I was kind of disconnected from my heritage, my culture. I didn't know quite who I was as I grew up. So in many ways, I grew up as an angry man, a bitter man, young man. But when I landed in Brixton again, South London, where is a neighborhood where many West Indians used to live, I reconnected with my Jamaican roots, especially reggae music. I remember in the mid-70s, I started listening to Bob Marley, and one of my favorite albums is the Exodus album, where he had that fantastic song, The Heathen. It's always been one of my favorite tracks. And we had a riot in Brixton in 1981. I was 18 years of age. And because of what I did during that riot, I was sentenced to a few months in prison. And I used my time wisely because I shared a cell with a Rastafarian, and he was an avid reader, and he gave me a copy of C.L.R. James' The Black Jacobins, the story of the Haitian Revolution. And that blew my mind away, Chris, because I've never come across any narrative like that in my life. It wasn't taught to me in school. You know, I couldn't find any stories like that anywhere. And so he gave me that, and my mind forever changed. I started to believe in myself because now I had a foundation. Now I had a history that I felt I belonged to. And so, coupled with the reggae music, that began my kind of development. And so, at first, I tried to be a musician. We had sound systems in Brixton, and we built the sound. Me and my friends, we called it Crucial Rocker, and I was the toaster. We used to call it toasters back in the day. And so I began my writing career like that, writing lyrics and songs and trying to create melodies for performances on sound systems, in house parties, blues dances, town hall dances. And so the writing stemmed from that.
Well, there's so much to unpack there. Let's start with your comment about Bob Marley, because I find interesting that Bob Marley was inspiration to you, because when I read your book, Cane Warriors, there are lyrics that and some references that seem to be to Bob Marley. They're not at all anachronistic, because Bob Marley, of course, drew from the culture of Jamaica for his lyrics. And so when you have a character sort of mention a natural mystic, when you have someone else make reference to the famous lyrics about live for yourself, you live in vain, live for others, and you will live again. These are all things that sort of drawn out of folk legend and myth and part of the Jamaican landscape. So it makes sense that these rebels you talk about in Cane Warriors will be drawn from the same myth source. Was that a conscious choice from your part, on your part, to have some of the words in your book echo some of the same myth source that Bob Marley drew from?
Absolutely, Chris. I mean, I'm a student of his lyrics, and any interview that I could find, or that Bunny Wailer had, or Peter Tosh had, and I remember the phrases they used, like the blood remembers, and I remember the famous, I think it's a Bunny Wailer quote, that if you live for yourself, you live in vain, but you live for others, you live again. And that's like a mantra for me. It really was, and still is. And that kind of guided me. That gave me the template to set the themes for Cane Warriors and relationship between Keverton and Moa and the rest of those mighty Cane Warriors. You know, I call them our glorious dead, and they are indeed our glorious dead. And so that was my mindset. And when I write, Chris, I always have a soundtrack of reggae playing softly behind me, because that is how I used to write my lyrics when I was 16, 17, 18. I'd have a boombox in the corner and I have a pen in hand. Sometimes I would write on the back of a reggae album or a record sleeve. And that is how I get into the mindset of these characters. So the reggae music and the references and the phrases are so important to my development as a writer.
Yeah, it's also interesting that you talk about the fact that, you did spend time in jail, you spent time in this home, you were often lost, and books and music were what saved you, because there is this disconnect sometimes, I think, with young people to revolutionary culture. It's not taught to them. They don't hear it. They hear junk like, from someone like 50 Cent, who I used to like, but now is endorsed Trump, seemingly. And it's hard to find the stuff that's really going to give you motivation and understanding of this revolutionary spirit that's been existed for a long time.
Yeah.
And there's this great professor named Vincent Brown. He teaches at Harvard. He wrote a book about Tacky too, called Tacky's Revolt. Your book, of course, is about Tacky's Revolt, which is about the true story of an enslaved person in Jamaica who led this revolt in 1760 that challenged the British Empire, and that kicked off a whole epic and a whole era of revolution that it helped kickstart, in some ways, the American Revolution, and then the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution. And we're not always tied to that whole series. People talk about the American Revolution, the French Revolution exist in a vacuum, but really, this revolution, the Haitian Revolution, really helped kickstart that. Can you talk to me a bit about why revolutionary Black folks are often written out of history?
Well, the great Chinua Achebe, I cannot remember the exact quote, but he said something like that only the victors tell the story, only the hunters tell the story of the hunt. The captors or the people who go out and hunt and so on, the lions or whatever. It said only the hunters get to tell the story, and I think that's been exactly the same parallel as our narrative. Only the conquerors get to tell their tale. For example, there's been many texts about William Wilberforce and what happened in the English Parliament in the 1800s. 1833, I think slavery was abolished. And I remember the 200-year anniversary, all we had was these texts from aristocrats and telling their story of how, the white saviors managed to save Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean. And people like Tacky and others were just marginalized and erased out of that history. And so really what I'm doing and what others are doing, Vincent, as you indeed mentioned, is we're trying to recapture that narrative and tell our perspective. And I think that's so important, especially for anybody who's studying this period. It's so crucial that we get to know. Because Chris, I have to admit, when I was a young man, say 8, 9, 10, 11, because I was so kind of brainwashed by what they was teaching me in school, when Tarzan used to appear on my TV screen and he's fighting all these Black folks, in Africa somewhere, I would cheer for Tarzan because I never knew anything better. I just thought, as my white peers thought, that Black people were savages. I believed that. That's what I grew up with. And so there was never any reference to me that we actually fought against slavery and so forth. And then when I dipped into American culture, like, for example, Gone with the Wind, I mean, I actually believe that those slaves depicted in that film were kind of happy with their existence. It's only when I started to read further that I understood that there must have been some kind of pain, some anger, some bitterness, but it was never showed in popular culture in the West. And so people like me had to search for it. And this is why it's so important that we recapture our narratives and tell them honestly with authenticity and tell and honor our ancestors.
And what you say is so important, because I think that people sometimes view slavery as this period where we were docile and people were able to sort of rule over us until Abraham Lincoln gave us back our freedom. That's not what happened. And again, there's another quote that Professor Brown uses about how slavery was actually a near perpetual state of war. It echoes, Bob Marley's famous song about war, that we were constantly fighting back. We were constantly doing these revolts, some big, some small. We were in a constant insurrection for 400 years, and no time where we just sitting back and allowing this to happen to us. And that's one reason why I love your narrative so much, because one of my favorite movies about the period of enslaved persons is that movie Django Unchained by Quentin Tarantino. And the reason I love it is because it's about fighting back. It's about heroism during a terrible time. It's not just about us being whipped and enslaved and put in chains. So he found this narrative of heroism tell during this awful time. and you do the same kind of thing here, only
Yeah.
based on reality. Tell me a bit about that, about finding that message of hope, that message of heroism during this awful time, and why that was important to you.
Well, Chris, once you undertake the research, I mean, I was looking at Haiti and I was looking at Jamaica, and I was just simply blown away by the amount, as you mentioned, of revolts there were everywhere across the island. Even in Haiti, 30 years before Toussaint Louverture led the Haitian Revolution in 1791, they were constantly revolting and having uprisings. And that just struck me. I thought, wow, you know, they could never have complete control on us, never. And so when I came to Cane Warriors, I really wanted to honor that spirit of never being happy with their condition, never being happy with their lot. And that was very important to me. And I guess I first learned that through reggae music. Which taught me that we were never this the obedient sufferer, if you like, this happy for our lot and going out into the fields. That was never the case. And so I think in this moment of time, 2020, where we had the Black Lives Matter, where we've seen statues of slavers pulled down and tossed into harbors and waters and so on, we really have to now address the narrative that's been constantly fed to the world for so many years. We need to change that narrative and assert our own narrative and how incredible these heroes were. For example, you know, almost every day in the UK, they show films like the 300 Spartans and their stand at, I cannot pronounce the place, forgive me, but you know the story I'm talking about, you know, the 300 Spartans and Hector and Achilles and so forth. And for me, Taki, Sam Sharp, Paul Bogle, they're just as heroic. So how comes they're not canonized? You know, so that really upsets me that in world history, it's not just British or West Indian history, it's world history. Because as you mentioned, what Taki did had reverberations. They must have heard about what Taki did in Haiti. They must have, because it was world news at that point of time. And this is when Toussaint Louverture was probably, 16, 17. So he's out there in Haiti working on where he's working. He's a slave. And he must have, his masters, who whipped him or whatever they did, must have learned about this. They must have brought the fear of God in them to make sure this doesn't happen to them. But it did anyway, because I'm sure they were inspired by what Taki tried to achieve in Jamaica in 1760. It's all linked.
Well,
For me, it's all linked.
I have a theory about that. I think that we don't hear about these things because they don't want it to happen again.
Yeah.
Because when you know about revolutions, successful revolutions, ones that have challenged the status quo and inspired others to take action, then you're more inspired to go about those revolutions yourself. You know, it's funny, back in antiquity, there was a pharaoh queen named Hatshepsut. She was one of the most powerful and successful pharaohs of all time, happened to be a woman. She ruled for over 20 years. After her death, the pharaoh that took her place, who was a man, erased her name from all of the temples and the monuments, because he likely didn't want people to know that women could rule Egypt successfully. And I feel the same thing happens to us time and time again, which is why you don't hear about more about Nat Turner, why you don't hear more about Taki, why you don't hear about Nanny of the Maroons, who led a successful revolution and ruled for years successfully. Because those stories tell you, oh, you can successfully fight back. Now, as I close your book, in a way, Taki's revolution, though, seemingly, without giving anything away, I think people can read Wikipedia and know that, you know, he does die in the end. But his revolution actually was ultimately successful because, you know, a child of Africa, Barack Obama, ended up becoming president.
Yeah.
A child of Jamaica, in Kamala Harris, may end up becoming vice president. So in the end, his spirit kind of lives on through the success of people who came from the same ancestors.
Absolutely. People are inspired by it. That's why we need to keep on telling these stories, need to keep telling these narratives, need to keep listening to the music that relates these legends. And for me, as you rightly say, he never lost. He never lost, because obviously there were people there who know of the story. I mean, my mother, I was reunited with her in the early 2000s, and I spent some time with her in Jamaica. And me being a storyteller, I wanted to know about the legends that she heard about when she grew up. You know, what stories she had to tell from the elders. And she said to me, Alex, I remember as a very young girl that Taki's name was mentioned because she lived adjacent to where the plantations were, the Frontier and Trinity in St. Mary. And she heard the elders speak about him, you know, in hushed tones, like he was some kind of living God still walking the land. And so obviously the old history had maintained and gone through so many years. What is this, over 200 and so years or so? But that legend, that name is still spoken. When my mother was a little girl growing up in St. Mary in the late 1930s, early 1940s, she remembered that. She couldn't quite place the story, but I said to myself, wow, oh my gosh, how did this miss me by? Because I've heard about Paul Bogle, Sam Sharp, and Marcus Garvey, and the rest of it. And so that is when I started to undertake my research. And what I discovered was, oh my God, you know, I mean, there's accurate aspects of the book, like for instance, the way the slaves would, if they were obedient or tried to run away, they would be made as cages, hoist them up so the rest of the slaves could see, and they would literally starve them to death. I mean, it was brutal. And to know that if you embark on a revolution, you know that this is coming to you, I mean, tells me of the incredible courage Taki and his followers had. And it instilled in me a pride that all Jamaicans should have, all Caribbean should have, because there's boats in Jamaica, but Barbados, Grenada, all over the Caribbean.
Yeah. Do you think that, speaking of the Caribbean, is there something happening in Caribbean literature? Is there something in the water in the Caribbean that's helping to fuel this boom in the literature in the diaspora in the UK and the US? Because I'm thinking of you and Marlon James and Edwidge Dandicat and Nicole Ben and Colin Channer and Kwame Dawes, and I could go on and on. There've been a number of these great Jamaican writers who are doing some of the most interesting work in literature and fantasy and memoirs and other forms. What is happening, do you think?
Well, Chris, we have to understand that maybe we miss great writers who have never had the opportunity to be published. Maybe they're working on, I don't know, in a beer factory, or maybe they're tending to their flock in the field. But nonetheless, there are great storytellers that have not had the opportunity to really let loose the narrative they want to tell. And so now, in the last 10, 15 years, the opportunity has arisen. There are more publishers like Akashic and others throughout the Caribbean. And now it's easier to self-publish. Now it's easier for someone like me to be published by one of the major publishers in London. I mean, 20, 25 years ago, it was almost impossible. And so we have this platform now. And there's a hunger there because we've been denied to tell our existence and our narrative for so many years. So there's this great hunger that we want to see our stories out there. We want to explore our existence, our lived experience, our ancestors' lived experience. And so that's why there's going to be a wave of all these narratives. They cannot stop it anymore. I mean, I know that in some aspects, the status quo are afraid of it, but it's coming. And it's great to see.
But here's one thing that worries me, because and I know you've talked about this too, that you can write a great book and then not get the reviews or the coverage that it really deserves. Tell us something that happened to me once. I wrote a biography of Bob Marley called Before the Legend, The Rise of Bob Marley. It got a lot of great reviews. It got written up in the Wall Street Journal. But then when it came time to give it a review, it never got reviewed in the New York Times. And around the same time it should have gotten a review, they reviewed two other books by two other non-Jamaican, non-Black authors. And I thought to myself, what in the world is going on here? I've got this book that has a quote from it from Rita Marley, who loved the book. I got
Yeah.
on the Today Show because it got covered in the Today Show. It got covered all these other places, but the literary establishment did not want to give it that place. They would rather
Yeah.
have these non-black, non-Jamaican authors cover the
Absolutely.
same kind of thing. It's almost like you know
Yeah.
the Elvis or Vanilla Ice kind of theory
Yeah.
thing happened in music, where they'd rather have these other people cover our culture. Have you encountered that, and how have
Yes,
you dealt with it?
absolutely I have. Absolutely I have. I wrote a book called East of Acre Lane, and it was reviewed fantastically well everywhere. But there was a certain level they would not let me put my head above. Like, for instance, when that book came out and I got the fantastic reviews, I was not invited to any major literary festival for that year. And I remember, let's speak about Bob Marley. I remember there was a book by Stephen Davis. There was a book by Timothy White. There's a book by Vivian Goldman who wrote about Exodus. They're all expansively reviewed all over the world. And I wonder, when I came across your work, I wonder, well, how comes you're not getting that exposure? What's stopping them why they're putting a seed on your head? It's almost like they're saying to you that you have no authority on our own history. You're not canonizing anyway. You're not allowed to do that. Only they can do that. It's almost like they're afraid for us to own our story, our own history. And we have to fight against that. I mean, despite that, I know that you and we will carry on writing anyway. So the next generation, hopefully it'll be easier for them. But you're so right, Chris. For so long, they have tried to stall this, to try and stall our growth, to try and stop our own narratives being emerged and being available widely all over the world. And yours, rightly, should sit alongside any biography of Bob Marley, or even above the Timothy Whites and the Stephen Davises and Vivian Goldmans and so on, who are still making so much money from his life and so on. I mean, how can that be right? How can that be right? It's like when they write about slavery in the Caribbean, all these white writers, politicians, and so on, they're raking it in. They're raking it in with their perspectives and so on. Where's our one? So we really need to start champion each other. So I'm so glad that you're interviewing me, because now I can say, right, I'm going to take a picture of your book. I'm going to put it on my website. I'm going to put it on my Twitter feed, and I'm going to promote the hell out of that. This is what we start needing to do for each other in the diaspora. So I can support you, you can support me, and we can support anybody else who's, wants to jump on board to bypass their censorship.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I think that censorship, these gatekeepers, they actually dictate the way in which our history and our culture is perceived, because certain people get elected to represent us or to interpret our culture, and it's hard to get past that. But right now, I'm an executive editor for Audible, the recorded books company, part of Amazon. But previously, I used to be the music critic for Time magazine, and I was always struck by how much the other critics, who almost none of them were Black at the time, how much their horrible criticism really shaped who was sort of tapped on the shoulder to become, like, the kings of hip hop. It was always stuff that was really kind of sexist or borderline racist and horrible. Some stuff I liked too, but I noticed the people who were really great, like the Roots, who I loved, and Lauryn Hill, who I loved, and they eventually, broke out and became famous too. But early on, they didn't get that kind of critical acclaim, love from the establishment as sort of true hip hop. And you see that happen again and again. It's happened throughout the 20th century and the 21st century,
Yes.
from blues to reggae to jazz to rock to hip hop. These gatekeepers affect who actually represents the music and who gets to speak for it and who becomes successful. And it also happens, I think, in literature, in terms of who gets reviews, the kind of stuff they focus in on. I've seen more books and movies about John Brown, who of course deserves some book movies, but you see more about John Brown than you do about Tacky, and that's wrong. It's not right. It shouldn't happen. But it's a symptom, an effect of who gets to interpret the stories for the masses.
Absolutely. Just recently, I saw a documentary about how Motown was created. And from very early on, Berry Gordy and Smokey Robinson decided that they have to be self-sufficient. And I think to a certain extent, when it comes to publishing or music, this is how we need to operate. We need to start to say to ourselves, we need to support our Black businesses, need to support our Black publishers. And so there's more freedom, if you like, to selecting the material that we think is important to us. And there's 2 or 3 small Black publishers in the UK in London that I try to support, and whenever they publish a book, I try to promote that as much as I can. And this is, I think, the route we need to take, because we're never going to, these big corporations, we're never going to hand it on a platter for us, especially the stories that we want to tell. And the stories that we want our grandchildren to read, to keep those legends alive so they know where they're coming from. They know their history, they know their culture, and so on. And so I really think with this Black Lives Matter movement, that needs to be the next step, how we preserve our history, how we preserve the likes of Taki and the narratives that we bring forward for that.
I'm wondering how things are for you in England, because here in America, as writers, it's tough for people psychically and sometimes economically, to do the kind of work they need to do, because we've got a racist as the president.
Yeah.
We've got who won't even say that Black Lives Matter, who doesn't believe in that systemic racism exists, and yet is still asking for the votes of Black people. We have voter suppression. It's hard for us to even express our will at the ballot box. We have to wait in long lines, risk COVID. And then, of course, we're part of a raging pandemic right now in America because of complete mismanagement from the White House. Black and brown people are dying at incredible rates that surpass those of white citizens. So we're living through a mess, and yet we know the way out of it is to create art that helps show us the way out and helps document our times. How do you keep your spirits up through all this and keep the writing going? Is it affecting people in England the same way it's affecting us here?
Oh, yes, it is, Chris. Definitely affecting us. And I have to admit, there's been times during this whole period where I have been depressed. When I see what happens in the US, when I see what happens over here, especially the way COVID is impacting on Black folks, especially what happened to George Floyd, because for me, that triggers memories in my life where, on the streets of Brixton and other places, Black people have lost their lives to police brutality. So it's not just a trigger for Americans, it's a trigger for everybody. Africa, the whole world, because as a Black man of my generation, we have seen that, we have heard about that. We know a family who has suffered from that. So it's definitely triggering. But what keeps me getting up in the morning and doing the work that I do, the writing and so forth, is that I know, because I'm well read, I know what my ancestors have suffered. I know what they've experienced. They died for me to have this opportunity, for me to write the Cane Warriors. They died so I could write the Issa Rae Lane or Island Songs. They never had the opportunity to tell their story or narrative. And so their spirit, their lives, and it's real, it's authentic. That's what makes me lift up my head again, if you like. Or, as Bob Marley said, take your stance again in The Heathen. So I'm taking my stance again to honor those who have passed me. And, I'm going to be inspired by them and keep going because, Chris, at the start of my career for many years, I could not get a gig. I could only get jobs going into prisons, young adult institutions. And so it's only later that I was allowed into schools where I could speak to students and present my books to librarians and so on. That's only been in the last 7-8 years. My first book was published 1999. I never saw any major literary festival. And so I had to cling on, if you like. But I always believed in the stories that I was telling. I always believed that the characters that I created were important and valid and worthy. I always believed that. And that belief come from reggae music, where I felt important, where I felt Bob Marley was singing about me. I felt Peter Tosh was singing about me. I felt Burning Spear was thinking about my struggle. And that's very important that we feel included, not just in music, but in the books that we read. We need to feel included. And so I really honor those writers who came before me, people like Chester Himes. I had to dip into the American bag because there wasn't too much Black British writing going on, but Chester Himes, Langston Hughes, people like that, I hung on to them. I really did. And the great C.L.R. James, of course, when I come across his work, that made me feel that my life is worth something. And the people around me, the people I grew up with, their lives were important just as much as anybody else.
Now, of course, speaking of your life being important, it's being documented in this new BBC One Amazon Prime series called Small Axe, executive produced by
Steve McQueen.
Yeah, by the great Steve McQueen, who did 12 Years a Slave. I'm really looking forward to seeing it. There's a whole episode named after you. I remember when I first saw it, I'm like, how great they're paying tribute to you by an episode name. I'm like,
yeah,
exactly about
it's
you.
incredible.
How did you feel when they reached out to you and actually and said, we're going to make this whole episode about your life? How did you feel about it? How did it work? How did you contribute?
Overwhelming, Chris. I was part of Steve McQueen's writing room. There was about 6 or 7 of us just sounding out ideas and themes of what this series should be inclusive of. And one afternoon, Steve said to all of us that he wants a story from a male perspective, a young man going through the institutions in London or Britain, the harsh institutions like a children's home or a prison or a young adult institution. And one of my fellow writers turned to me and said, Alex, your story, I mean, we cannot get better than that, because I was in this really brutal institution from the age of 2.5 to 15, where I was physically abused, sexually abused, and I managed to survive that. And then I went to Brixton, and I was part of that struggle with police persecution and the rest of that. And then I ended up in prison at 18 of age, where I felt my life was over. But as I mentioned before, I came across this avid reader, Russifarian, and it's such a blessing that he was well read. And he gave me a confidence. He said to me, Chris, yes, Alex, you might be damaged, but you're like a bird that flies over the ocean, gets sick and drops in the sea. And in that sea, there might be an oil slick, but the bird manages to get to shore and clean himself of the oil. And it's still a bird, it's not a fish. I remember that distinctly. He said, Alex, you're still a bird, you're not a fish. You survived all that has been thrown at you. So start believing in yourself and get to know where you're coming from.
And what the actor who plays you, what kind of notes did you give that actor about how to play you?
Right. Well, the first thing he wanted to know is how I used to skank to reggae music. So we had a lesson of dancing and so on. And so I just had some time with him for a day or so, and I was instructing him of how I felt. I think the emotions are very important, because sometimes on the screen, our lives are depicted as, oh, Black guys have to be strong, they have to be macho. But the truth is, when I was very young, I was very fragile, I was very vulnerable, I was quick to temper. All these emotions I carried in me. And so he had to carry that off. And he's done an incredible job. And Steve McQueen, he's like ourselves, Chris. He wants to tell those untold stories that never get the air of day. And so that is what he was focused on, because he felt like I did, and you do, that our stories have been hidden for so long. How comes these stories haven't emerged many, many years ago? And there's been many filmmakers, many script writers, I'm talking about Black people in the arts in this country, and I'm sure in America too, they have never been given the opportunity to air their stories and relate their story to the screen or to the page or wherever it may be, because I'm sure the corporate publishing system in America is probably biased and probably still is. And it's the same in the UK. And so Steve really wanted to address that. So the 5 films are specifically about telling untold stories of our existence in the UK from 1968 to the mid-1980s.
Well, we'll talk about untold stories. Before we came on, we were talking a bit about a question my daughter raised to me before I came on, saying, how do you teach slavery in schools? Because obviously it's such a horrific subject. It's been mistaught for so long. People have miseducated about American slavery with Gone with the Wind, and that whole myth of us being happy throughout our period of servitude. Or they skip over any Black sources at all that speak to slavery, and we hear white interpretations of our own experiences. So what advice would you give? Because your book, I think, is such a great document, a great text, I think, for any teacher that wants to talk about the period of slavery in the Americas, the larger Americas. But what is your advice to teachers about teaching this period?
It's difficult, Chris, because the depiction of how we existed with slavery depicted in such films as Gone with the Wind is so entrenched. We have to remember that it is still the most successful film in history in terms of box office, ratios up to the present day. And so we have to somehow try to erase this idea of the happy slave who would do anything for their masters, and their lives, their beings, they are so much more important than the slave's condition. We really need to start erasing that kind of idea, that thought in many white people's heads that it wasn't like that at all. Not in the Caribbean, not in the Americas, not in Brazil or anywhere else. There's always, as I mentioned earlier, there's always revolts here and there that maybe many of them we've never heard about. So we really need to go to the start of our story in Africa and describe our condition there, and then describe our condition as we were taken over across the Atlantic and placing these places of brutality, if you like, from North America down to Brazil. We need to describe that lived experience. We need to describe that need, that hunger for freedom. That's the first thing we need to address. And then we need to describe those successful revolutions, and they were some, and what courage it took to take on their masters. Incredible courage, and we need to put that in some kind of canon so people know that it's there, place it in world history, along with the likes of Hector, Achilles, the 300 Spartans. They deserve their place, and we need to start insisting and asserting that our stories, our narratives are crucial and important to anybody who wants to study any kind of world history. We're part of that. We're not just a fragment. We're not just some kind of offshoot. No, we're not. We're part of this whole story. I mean, if you're beginning with the Caribbean, we need to start from the very start, and we need to document those heroes. I mean, before Toussaint Louverture led his Haitian revolution, there were people before him. Those names need to be mentioned. Taki needs to be mentioned. So many need to be mentioned and saluted and canonized. That is the work we have to do.
Well, one reason why I loved Cane Warrior so much is that and why I think it works so well as a text for young people, is that it's great. It's a great book to read. It's exciting to read. One reason why I think Gone with the Wind made as much money as it did and has been as lasting as it did is not only because of the racism that appeals to racists, but also because the cinematography is terrific. There's great stars in it. And so it's packaged in appealing ways. So I think one thing we can do, we've got to create more Black Panthers, things that are counter myths, that celebrate our identity in ways that are exciting and entertaining and that are more powerful than all the other negative counter myths that are out there. When you can create works of entertainment that are emotional, that are big, that kids and young people want to read, not just because it's time to eat their broccoli and eat their vegetables, but because they actually love to absorb it, then I think you've gone a long way to sort of beating the system at its own game by creating better stuff than they do. I mean, that's what Bob Marley did. He just, every one of his albums was great. Yeah. That's why he spread around the world. It couldn't be denied. When you create that undeniable stuff, that can conquer all the stuff that's trying to keep you down.
Yeah, and when you do that, people engage wherever. They give you a high respect. When you offer that to the world, they really do. I mean, we can use Bob Marley as a reference. I mean, when he went to New Zealand, he was received like a conquering hero. And people often forget that. And when people try to tell me, oh, but the Beatles were bigger, whatever, you know, Chris, when I travel, and I've traveled quite widely, I've gone to places like Algeria. I've gone to places, you know, in Africa, and you visit a market stall, and then there's a Bob Marley badge, there's a Bob Marley T-shirt. You know, I don't see no John Lennon there. I don't see no Elvis Presley there. Whether it's New Zealand, whether it's in the middle of Africa, whether it's in the Arab world, I don't see those so-called world figures there. I just see Bob Marley all over. So that tells me that I'm on the right track here. You know, retelling, trying to recapture my narrative. I'm on the right track because that is respected. I mean, yes, we have to counter that Western media kind of thing the way they do, what they try to heighten their culture as much better than anybody else's. But we forget that there's so much more millions of people in the world than white Americans or white Europeans, so much more. And so we can engage with that. We can relate their stories and they can relate their stories to us. And we know our stories are powerful. We know that we come from a powerful people. And I know there's a fear that equality for some whites is like they're being oppressed. They feel like they're being oppressed, but it's not the case. We just want equality, but they have this great fear that equality means for them some kind of lessening of their life opportunities, which is not true. We just want equality, and I think that's what some of them are running away from. So this is why we've got to be strong in our resolve, because there's no doubt there's going to be a backlash, even if maybe Biden gets elected. There'll be a backlash from the far right because they're going to be very afraid that they're going to lose their opportunities of life. They're not going to be the top dog anymore. That's a great fear for many people in the West. And so, you know, but we have to stand firm, if you like. You know, get up, stand up, if you like. You know, and reaffirm our equality, if you like. We need to start doing that, and that comes through music. That comes through written works, that comes through our theatre, that comes through all these things. And that's how I first accessed it, not so much through books, but through music and the arts. Yes, I did find books, but as I mentioned earlier, books about the Caribbean assistance were very hard to come across until I found C.L.R. James.
Now, I want to know your secret in terms of bringing history alive for readers. I mean, different authors have different approaches to research. And someone like Tom Wolfe used to spend years researching a subject before he wrote about it. So he'd know it inside out. He could have written, you know, a journalistic article on it based on how much research he's done. Then there are other writers like Toni Morrison, when she wrote Beloved, she apparently didn't do any research at all. She just read a newspaper article and let her imagination take her the rest of the way. And it was still a fantastic book, obviously. But what is your sort of methodology? What is your approach? Do you spend a lot of time in libraries and archives figuring out everything about the past before you fictionalize it? Or are you someone who just needs to have a spark and then you let your imagination run wild? What's your approach?
First of all, I need a spark, and I do my research. I don't spend days and days and days in libraries and archival institutions, but and then the characters come alive in my head, and I let them marinate in my head. Like Moa, at first, I wanted to write from the perspective of Taki. I thought, oh, what a world history figure. You know, let me write about this incredible man. But research was hard to come by, you know, about his origins in Africa. I mean, in some cases, he was being referred to as the African prince. In some cases, there were other narratives. So I couldn't quite lock on to his existence in Africa. And then when I did further research and I started to understand that if you was 11, 12, 13 or 14-year-old boy living on these plantations, you were treated like a man. You were whipped like a man. You had to do 14, 15-hour days when it was harvest time and so forth. And I thought, oh my gosh, you know, this could be such a more powerful beast if my main character was a 14-year-old boy. And so I gave him the name Moa. You know, I created a template, a 2-page template on my main character. And so I gave him the name Moa Ambassa. And Moa Ambassa it was one of the top sound systems in South London when I was 16, 17, 18. I used to have a Moran Butter scarf, and I used to cheer for them when they used to play their music. And so and then I tried to imagine his family circumstances. What is his mother? Where's his mother? Has he got any siblings? So all this comes into my creative mind before I even write a page of prose or start on the first page. I wanted to give him some kind of grounding. Okay, who is this boy? Who is special to him? Who is dear to him? What does he, how does his day-to-day come about? What tools does he need? So I did my research on the bill hooks and plantations and so on. And then I wanted to give him some kind of family. So he has Keverton, his best friend. He has Homaya, one of the young girls who works on a plantation and takes the sugar cane to the mill house. So I needed to give him an everyday existence. And this is all done in my head before I actually wrote a page, because I just wanted to visualize what it must be like. So before I went to my bed at night, I would close my eyes and just visualize how life could be treating Moa at this point of time at 14 years of age in 1760 Jamaica. I need to just get inside his head. And then once I got inside his head and I knew what he was all about, that is when I could start write the story. And it's really, I just had to fill in the gaps because I had the skeleton of the story. I knew that the Frontier and Trinity plantations, there was a mass revolt there. I knew that Tacky led them on to Fort Haldane near Captain Morgan's place. The Firefly Estate. My father took me to the Firefly Estate in 1987 when I was reunited with him. And I was totally unaware that just adjacent to there was this massive revolt there where many white soldiers were killed and ammunition stolen, and the guns, I think it was 40 guns, and they were taken and stolen, to help the resistance. And so once I had those bare facts, I could put flesh on the bones. That's what I like to say, flesh on the bones. I could start using my imagination of the characterizations, the interactions that Moa has with Tacky and so forth. Like I decided to give Tacky a sister because I felt the Anansi link was very important, because there's no way in my mind that these people would forget their African religions and belief systems, and it cannot be wiped away overnight. So I had to give homage and honor that, because they're going to believe in the god Naomi and everybody else, Abawi. They're going to have that in their hearts and in their minds. So I made sure that Moa was being taught that, and Tacky was, was referencing it all the time. That was very important for the narrative, because, you cannot just be taken to Jamaica and just forget about all that. It's still in your heart. And so with that knowledge, I could write a novel. And once I did that work in my head and created the templates, it only took about 3-4 months to write.
Well, I want to get to some of the questions we've gotten in from people who are watching. And one of the questions is, was it hard to find a publisher for Cane Warriors?
Not really, because I had built up a good reputation. I was nominated. I won a number of awards. But with Cane Warriors, there was a few publishers who wanted to publish it. They thought, wow, this is something new and fresh, especially in YA fiction. I think it's been rarely done, a narrative like this, for any kind of children's or YA fiction. So I think that was an advantage to me, that it was fresh. It was something out of the box, that's not in the traditions of what they've been publishing for the last, 20, 30, 50, 100 years or so. And I remember I did write a critique for BBC Radio over here in the UK about Robinson Crusoe and how racist that narrative was. And I was remembered for that. And so with that and my growing reputation, I felt I was in a very good position to write a book like this, to be accepted and be marketed very well here in the UK. It's being received incredibly well. And so I don't think, Chris, to answer your question fully, that if I came out with this book 10, 15 years ago, it would have been accepted. I really don't think. I think they would have run away from it. But now, because of what's going on in the world now, because there are more Black writers emerging from the Caribbean and the UK and America, not as much as I would like, but we are emerging. We are becoming a wave. I don't think they can resist it anymore. Narratives like this.
Okay, another question is, beyond getting reviewed, do you also find that white writers tend to get better backing in terms of marketing and advances from publishers?
Yes. Yes, they do. Which is something I've had to fight against for most of my career. Even though I've won major awards, sometimes I find that, especially with the marketing, it's only my last 2 or 3 books that I felt that I've been marketed appropriately. But before that, I hardly got 2 minutes for my PR, wherever publisher I was. You know, especially in my early career, I got nothing. I had to do the footwork myself. But now, I mean, my publishers over here for Cane Warriors, they've been fantastic. They really have. They put me on platforms that I've never been on before. So I'm thankful for that. But I still see my other brothers and sisters in the publishing game sometimes denied that opportunity, denied the opportunity to attend a literary festival or go on mainstream radio or television and so forth. And so for me, that's the next step. There is a movement over here to make publishing more diverse regarding editors, people in marketing, sales, and so on. But also, there should be a movement targeted to broadcasters and newspapers where we do not get reviewed as well as we should do, or even featured. I mean, it's so rare that I come across a magazine published over here or in the US, because my sisters, they buy these magazines, to see a Black author being featured and to speak about their lives, their existence, their work. It's still in 2020 so rare. So we need to start making these publications accountable for what they do or what they don't do. And I'm sure that is true in the US as it is here. So that is the next step. I mean, again, I'm going to use this Black Lives Matter, where our features matter, our stories matter, our authors matter. They deserve that place. Just like Taki deserves his place in world history. Black authors deserve their place to be reviewed and featured in magazines, not just Black magazines, but everywhere. Why not?
Well, I think we've reached an end here because we were, I think, scheduled to go for an hour. Am I not correct? I think we have one more question that came in. I don't have a question, but I wanted to let our panelists know how grateful I am for doing this interview and for writing the stories that my kids may not learn in school, but that are so important. I'm glad that there are writers like you sharing the stories of brave people and Black history. So
thank you.
That's a nice note to sort of end things on. I hope people check out Alex's book. It's called Cane Warriors. It's a terrific book. I think that it's not only worthwhile for historical reasons, but also just a great read. You can have be taken on this great adventure by reading this book, and it's a perfect book for, I think, if you have a young person in your life who wants to know more about history and Black history and the history of the Americas. This is a book you want to check out. I can't tell you how entertained I was and moved by reading this book. So I'm just so glad you're able to sort of get this out there to the world and to tell these stories that need to be told. So thanks for taking the time to talk to me. And I'm looking forward to seeing the Alex Wheatle episode on Small Axe on the BBC One and on Amazon Prime Video here in the States. So a lot of Alex,
I believe,
going on.
Yeah, I believe it's going to be broadcast on Amazon Prime on December the 11th. Right. So tune in for that date. Right. And thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, me speaking to you and connecting with you. And I'm definitely, if you can give me a link for your work, especially the Bob Marley book, I will try to promote that.
Definitely. And thank you to Wild Rumpus and also to Akashic Books for making this possible. I'm going to turn it back over to the Wild Rumpus folks. This has been terrific. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
This has been such a wonderful conversation today, and we feel truly lucky to have had the both of you here in conversation. I hope everyone who's joined in today, thank you very much for joining in. I hope you're walking away with a lot to think about. Make sure to get your copy of Cane Warriors. We have them in stock at the store, and don't forget your 15% off code. And I just want to say a really sincere thank you to the two of you for taking out the time today to share your stories with us.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.